All right, so welcome back to Sanctuary. Yes, we've got some official new updates straight from the Diablo 4 dev team. So who wants to see more expanded butcher type enemies in Diablo 4? Well, the dev team had some very cool teases about that today, as well as how the sorcerer, druid, and other classes will be evolving past the beta cap. And we got a very detailed response about the biggest worries from the beta, which include the lackluster dungeon design and how dungeons will differ in the full game. And later in the video, we'll discuss why couch co-op isn't on PC, but the question is, will it ever come to PC? Also, smack that like button to buff my barbarian. And check out the pinned comments for my PS5, Xbox Series X, and Nintendo Switch giveaway for my subscribers, so check that out. All right, time to get into the details. The new interview with Diablo General Manager Rod Ferguson and Diablo 4's Game Director Joe Shelley. So here is the first question. It says this: one other bit of feedback I saw, and this came from a few people, was they're not being overly enamored with the dungeon design. The gist seemed to be that dungeons were too big and involved backtracking to grab keys and unlock doors and so on. Is this something you've seen, and are you taking a look at it? Now, let's get into the actual response from Joe Shelley, first of all, who goes on to say this: we have seen it, yeah, there's a few elements there. There's some players who we added the ability to teleport out of dungeons via the UI, and some players don't realize that exists. But certainly, there are cases within the dungeon where you're going to get a key and then you're going somewhere else. Yeah, you know, what I'm curious about is why there was no tutorial structure telling you and indicating that, hey, you can quickly exit the dungeon, if you guys don't know this, by opening up the map, going to the entrance location on your map, clicking on it, and then you can actually just instantly transport out of the dungeon. That would have been nice to know at the beginning, so they definitely need a tutorial key for that. Also, we have this right here, but when you think about dungeons overall, there are well over 100 dungeons in the game, and in the beta, of course, you're only seeing, the dungeons that exist in the Fractured Peaks region, which is about 20% of the overworld. One of the design decisions we made is we wanted the dungeons, an individual dungeon, to have certain properties about it that were consistent and tied to that dungeon and that place in the world. So that when you go into a dungeon, it's not drawing out of a raffle of all the elements. There are some things that are consistent. And he's talking about, of course, each region looking unique. However, the problem is, from the complaints that I'm seeing, despite the fact that we're in Fractured Peak, although it has a very specific look to it, tone to Fractured Peaks, it's the actual layout that is redundant and the problem, and the backtracking that is the issue. Furthermore, we have this right here, and the way that we want players to approach that as they're leveling up is to look at it as, I want to do each of these different dungeons, and that's incentivized through things like the Codex of Power and the Renown system that give you a sort of checklist for all the dungeons you can do. And then when you get into the end game, after you've completed the campaign and you get access to the Nightmare Dungeon system, we have the sigils that modify dungeons in really cool ways with buffs and nerfs, and those dramatically modify the dungeon. But because the dungeons are designed with some properties to start with, you can get a sigil for a dungeon and have some context, for what that means. It's not just a random name that can be anything. Okay, I get it. You know, it's going to be cool that the enemies will change up here dependent on the sigil that you get. And of course, it would mutate the boss, I suppose you would say. But again, it would be neat if those sigils would actually change the layout of the dungeon itself and evolve the layout or randomize in some weird way. They are not giving any indication that the sigil actually does that. So again, they're not really responding as to the exact concern that we have. And Ron Ferguson says this: people are seeing dungeons at the baseline level. It'll be interesting the feedback once people get to experience what it means to go through sigils and get to see now there's more monsters, now they have a different ability, now you're being debuffed this way and they're being buffed that way, and it's going to feel like a much different experience, which again, that sounds neat, but yeah, I want to hear about the actual layout and I want to hear a solution as to backtracking through these dungeons. So this is very much, in my opinion, a non-answer to the problems and concerns that we have from the beta. Now we have this right here. I've seen people say the game is easier as a sorcerer with ranged abilities than it is as a barbarian who has to fight up close, and the rogue is somewhere in between. I've had a go at all the classes and I tend to agree. Oh, and the feedback is coming from people who have somehow taken all 3 currently available classes to level 25. I wondered if everything is working as intended, or if you're looking at it again with an eye to potentially rebalancing it? Great question right there, as we are playing as the rogue. All right, this gameplay, by the way, comes from my twin bro, Ryan. So thank you, Ryan, for the gameplay. This is awesome to see. All right, so Joe Shelley says this: whenever we make changes to the game, it affects the balance. So balance is a continual progression. And in particular, this beta, in addition to the technical aspects that Rod was talking about, is an opportunity for us to look at balance in the wild and make improvements. So certainly there are things like Hammer of the Ancients is a little bit underpowered, and Frost Sorcerers are pretty strong. Arc Lash is a little weak right now. There's a few things like that. So yeah, they're going to have a wide assortment, a wide list of things that they will be patching up here in the future. Or patching down, depending on if they're nerfing or buffing. But anyway, here we go. It says, but in general, there are no classes that are only for the really skilled people. When you see that campfire lineup, it's not just mechanics that you're choosing, it's also the class fantasy. So, if you have, for example, a fantasy of being a rogue, we don't want you to pick rogue because you think that character looks really cool, and then for us to come back and say, oh no, that's only for people who have 60 hours of Diablo. So it sounds like they want these characters to be playable no matter what your skill is. Check it out. It says, you're not good enough. We absolutely don't want that to be the case. So again, that's kind of what my theory was in my previous video, was that they were kind of designing the game for all skill ranges, trying to make it as user-friendly as possible, I suppose you would say. But I guess some people want more depth to some of these systems. However, balance is an entirely different discussion when it comes to this sort of thing. And it's just when you are in a cooperative environment, especially, you don't want some sorcerer just absolutely dominating the entire field when the barbarian is being held back and not doing much. That is just not fun. So that's where I think the big problem is with the current balancing issues. Now, it says this: the way that we approach it is that we make sure that for each class, there are builds that are accessible for players, and then there are builds or styles of play. And you mentioned the rogue, the melee rogue. It's more challenging to play than a ranged rogue, for example. And within the melee rogue, you can get into like, all right, well, I want to build where I shadow dash through an enemy and I blade twist and I try to get the blades to go through as many enemies as possible. There's a lot of opportunity for high skill gap there. Certainly a rogue and melee rogue presents lots of additional opportunities because it is more dodge-based class, expecting more use of evade. And they expect players to actually play in this way, and it's considered more difficult. I think they may actually need to consider also, I don't know, adding more defensive abilities for this class or tapping into that a little bit more. I don't know if there's going to have to be buffs in this way. I myself have not had the chance to really dive into the rogue as much as I want. So yeah, I cannot wait to do that, hopefully in the open beta period. Now, we have this right here, but our overarching goal is that players can embrace the fantasy of it, and then they can lean into the playstyle that they want, or if they want a higher skill gap, they can lean into that. Now, when we talk about playstyles, one thing that I personally noticed when I was playing actually as the Barbarian is that I was trying my own playstyle, and I thought I was super powerful. Then I got to this certain boss. Then I realized, wow, I have to respect my character to adjust. And I was kind of forced, honestly, into a bleed build to even beat this boss, which is a bit concerning because it seems like there is like this ultimate build for the class beyond your playstyle. So it kind of interrupts your intended playstyle. And I think that is a little worrying. I'm hoping that you can have several different playstyles within one class that can actually be extremely powerful when compared to one another. So that's my hope. We'll have to see if that ends up being true. But right now, there's a lot to be desired on that front, at least in my opinion. Now, Rod says this: the thing that can't be overlooked either is you're only getting to play the first 25 levels, and the classes don't stay balanced with each level change. The Barbarian is a really great example because the Barbarian has the most weapons of any character, and because of that, they have the most equipment slots of any character, which means they could have the most legendary effects. So once you get all legendaries, the Barbarian can be super strong because it's got two, legendary effects with other characters. You don't have to, but you're not going to get legendaries until mainly beyond 25 and above. So they're openly admitting that, yeah, the Barbarians are the weaker of the classes, especially at the beginning of the game. That might bother some people when it comes to leveling up quickly. Furthermore, it says same thing with sorcerers. They have the 2 enchantment slots. That means you can have the most skills of any class. And for example, the druid specialization happens in Scott's Glen, which won't be in the upcoming open beta. So you're going to play to 25 levels without ever being attuned to the animal spirits, which is really important to what the druid feels like. That's, wow. For me personally, like considering that this is a demo and kind of like a representation of the game, for them to miss such a critical feature of the druid, that's kind of gonna be, I don't know if people will tap into how strange the balancing will feel. Maybe I hope they don't cancel their pre-order just assuming, oh, that's it for the druid, you know? So it's kind of strange that they don't at least let you test that out in the beta to say, hey, this is a little bit more of what we're going to be offering with the druid. In fact, I think it would be wise for them to have some sort of video preview as to what you could potentially expect next as an example for the druid, so people aren't kind of caught off guard like, that's it, you know what I mean? So I hope there's not that type of reaction with this one. All right, furthermore, we have, so the notion of, yes, there are individual skills that need tweaking. There's also this notion about they can come into their own over a period of time. So to say, oh, it's much harder as a barbarian in the lower levels is true. But when you're level 40 as a barbarian, you might be one of the strongest classes because of the additional 2 extra aspects, legendary effects you can have. Yeah, so now I'm a little bit worried about balancing in co-op. I think that's where it's going to be really noticeable, some of these issues that pop up with certain characters being weaker at certain levels than the other characters, and then finally coming into their own. So to me, it sounds like the barbarian is just going to have a little bit more of a rougher time, especially at the beginning of the game. I'm hoping that that is not true as we head into the end game and that they are more a level playing field with the rest of the classes. But yeah, I don't know. I think that it's always going to be where someone is just going to be so OP when you're playing with other people, especially when we're talking about ranged characters like the sorcerer. Unless they decide to nerf, we'll see. This one right here, so something I was delighted to hear about and had no idea about until I came into work this morning and read about it, is the Butcher. Quick explainer, the Butcher was a ferocious enemy originally from Diablo 1, and now he's in Diablo 4 as a surprise ambusher in dungeons. He shows up seemingly at random and then disappears after a certain amount of time, and by all accounts is as ferocious as he always was. Yes. I ran into him, and let me tell you what, I was running away so freaking fast. Now, Joe Shelley says this. First off, we really like the way that some monsters can change the player's gameplay priorities. If you look at the Treasure Goblin, quick explainer, the Treasure Goblin appears at random as well, and you have to kill it before it runs away to get its loot. Yep, also ran into those, and that's kind of fun. I like that gameplay change. Furthermore, they say this, one of the things that can be really fun is changing up the player's goals at any given moment. And the Treasure Goblin does that by running off with a pile of loot that you want, so you're likely to opt into the extra danger to get it. And the Butcher does that by ambushing you and creating a situation where you're likely to run and potentially run into other danger or navigate under pressure. So broadly speaking, in Diablo 4, we're looking for other ways to add that kind of gameplay that changes the player's experience on the fly. Yeah, you know, I want to see more random encounters. I love this sort of thing. It doesn't have to exactly be like the Butcher. I think of games like Red Dead Redemption 2, which had excellent random encounters, or even Ghost of Tsushima, where you just run into some sort of scenario that has an actual story. That's something that I love. Of course, now this stuff doesn't really matter to the end game. It's only really mattering to fleshing out the open world completely. But yeah, of course, you don't want to be running for your life all the time in the open world, running into many different types of Butcher enemies. So I think that they might be thinking about this in a different way. So different styles of gameplay loops between like the Treasure Goblin, the Butcher style enemy, and maybe even some sort of other archetype, I guess you would call it. So yeah, curious to see what they do with it. Alrighty then, so what's next? So check this out right here. It goes on to say this, it makes me wonder what people's expectations should be about queuing when the game comes out. Is there an expectation that queues will be a thing we have to deal with to some degree? Great question, and the response is this one right here. Of course, the ideal is that there are no queues. That is where we want to be. Basically, what we're having today in the beta is what we'd like to have for launch. You go in, there's no queue, you go. And one way to actually stop worrying about this is to have a button that says offline play. I still think that should be an option. I just don't get it because even though there are no queues, the one thing that I have experienced is lag, which is insane because I want to play this as a single player game primarily. Yes, I will hop into the instances with world bosses, but again, that stuff can and should be able to be experienced offline in single player, in my opinion. Now, we have this right here. Sometimes queues are a part of how many servers are available and those sort of things, but the other side of queues, honestly, is around protecting the services. Sometimes you'll put a queue in place just so that if there's one particular service, like writing to the database, that you're trying to not overwhelm, you'll add to the queue to say, hey, let's just slow down a little bit while we fix this and look at it. So it's not always just availability of space. Sometimes something's being investigated or you're trying to manage pressure on one particular thing until you can reinforce it. Again, give me the offline button. I don't want to hear any of this. I don't care. Furthermore, we have this right here, and that actually is what happened. We actually turned up the queues a little bit to protect this wall we were working, and then once we did the work, we were able to start dialing it up, and the queue was going back down again. So, I will at least say, at the very least, that they have done a good job limiting the queue amount, and at the end of the beta, I was definitely getting into the game pretty much instantly, but again, despite that, lag was definitely an issue. Disconnects did happen. Furthermore, we have this right here. So I was looking on the Diablo subreddit to see people's general reactions because that's a good gathering place for them. And one note I saw mentioned couch co-op and how it was a console-only feature. Firstly, is that right? And the confirmation is yes, that is right. And I don't know if it bothers you or not that couch co-op isn't on PC, but it would be a nice feature to have on PC for sure. So let's get into it more. This person then wrote an impassioned post about couch co-op, and the salient point seemed to be that why was a series that originated on PC now lacking an additional feature that consoles get? Yeah, great question. Rod Ferguson responded, it's a technology question. Trying to do shared screen co-op on PC is much more challenging when it comes to account management and how you play together. Does it sound like an excuse? Let me know. Furthermore, Rod says this in response to why? How is it different from console? Well, console is a pre-setup for that in terms of the ways you can associate the accounts to it. Furthermore, follow-up question, because those systems allow multiple users to be signed in, and Rod confirms exactly, whereas trying to get two Battle.net accounts signed into the same PC at the same time, it's a technology problem. And the notion of two people sitting together at a desk, when you prioritize the problems you have to solve, solving for two people sitting at a desk playing on the same PC is a lower priority when the majority of couch co-op that's going to happen is going to be in front of a 65-inch TV. And there's no doubt that that is true. I think co-op really does originate kind of from console. But again, with that being said, it sure would be nice to have that option of being able to have couch co-op, or I guess you would say in this way, desk co-op on PC with, of course, Diablo 4. I don't know. I just wouldn't hold your breath for this feature to make its way in Diablo 4, honestly. So there it is, the latest happenings around Diablo 4, some interesting things going on. I'm kind of curious to see what happens with the classes after we reach level 25 and get some of those special additions that they were talking about here to the Sorcerer, Druid, and, Barbarian. I'm mostly curious about the Barbarian. I myself really enjoyed playing as the Barbarian class. But again, I had to definitely respect. I could not go with what I was trying to go with in terms of play style. So I'm hoping that there's several different play styles that are equally as powerful for each class. We'll see. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned for more. Remember, check out that description down below, or the pinned comment, I should say, down below for that PS5, Xbox Series X, and Nintendo Switch giveaway for my subscribers. And I will see you all next time. Take care.